By the time they realized they were off the trail, the light was already dying. The Appalachian woods had a way of swallowing the sun whole, leaving only the thin blue glow that made everything look distant and flat. The five of them stood in a rough circle, breathing hard, the quiet pressing in. It was supposed to be a loop, Nate said, as if saying it out loud would make the trail reappear. It is a loop, Mark answered, pulling the map out of his pocket, his jaw tight. Somewhere we missed a turn. 2 hours ago, Thomas added. He wasn't accusing, not exactly, but his tone was sharp enough to make Sarah look away. Arguing won't help, she said quickly. We need to find somewhere to camp before it gets dark. The forest stretched in every direction, identical and endless. The usual chorus of cicadas and birds had gone quiet, leaving only the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. Then Lena saw it. Over there. At first, Mark thought it was just more trees, a break in the branches maybe. But when they pushed through the undergrowth, they stepped into a clearing. The cabin stood alone, squat and weathered, its tin roof bent in one corner as if something had fallen on it years ago. The clearing was choked with tall grass, but there were no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign anyone had been here for decades. No one spoke for a long moment. It looks abandoned, Sarah said finally. It also looks dry, Nate replied. He was already heading for the porch. The boards groaned under his boots, but held. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the air was still and stale, but not rotten. The place was one room, just big enough for a table, 3 mismatched chairs, and a cast-iron stove that looked like it hadn't been lit in years. Dust covered everything except for a single mug on the table, as if someone had been here recently, or had left in a hurry. It'll do, Thomas said, unslinging his pack. Better than sleeping under the trees. They set up quickly. No one wanted to talk about how strange it felt to be there, how the clearing seemed unnaturally quiet, quieter than the woods had been just minutes earlier. By the time Nate coaxed a fire out of the stove, night had fallen. The warmth was a relief, the flicker of the fire almost comforting. Almost. Mark sat near the door, watching the flames. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't empty. Not really. Not in the way a place should be empty. Lena kept her camera in her lap, fingers resting on the lens cap. She hadn't taken a single picture since they arrived. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the tin roof. Tomorrow we find a trail, Mark said, more to himself than to the others. Tomorrow, Thomas echoed. But no one slept well. It wasn't the noise. There was no noise. That was the problem. The forest, the wind. Even the creak of the cabin had gone still, as if the whole mountain were holding its breath. When Mark closed his eyes, he thought he could feel the weight of the woods pressing down on the cabin, like they had sunk too deep into some place that didn't want them there. And then the first snowflake touched the window. By morning, the world had changed. When Mark opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was his own breath hanging in the air. The stove had gone out sometime in the night, and the cabin was as cold as a refrigerator. Why is it so cold? Sarah's voice cracked as she sat up, rubbing her arms. Thomas was already at the window. You should see this, he said. They gathered around. Outside, the clearing was buried under a sheet of white. Snow reached halfway up the porch steps, untouched, perfect. The trees stood silent, heavy with frost. It was August yesterday, Nate said finally, his voice flat. No one answered. They stayed inside as long as they could, huddled near the stove once Nate coaxed it back to life. The fire helped, but it didn't erase the way the cold pressed against the walls, as if the forest itself wanted in. By afternoon, the snow had thickened. The world outside blurred to white, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the roof. "This isn't right," Sarah said. She was sitting on her sleeping bag, knees pulled up to her chest. Her voice was small. "This doesn't just happen. Not here. Not now. Blizzards happen," Thomas said. He was staring into the fire, even in August. "Not like this," Lena said softly. She had her camera in her lap again, but she hadn't taken a single picture. The hours stretched. They took turns feeding the fire, but the warmth never seemed to last. Conversation turned short, clipped, not out of anger, but because no one wanted to say what they were really thinking. Mark kept glancing at the door. He didn't know why, as if he was expecting someone to knock. As the day dragged toward night, the storm outside grew louder, beating against the cabin like a tide. Nate broke first. "We should try to leave in the morning," he said suddenly, his voice too loud in the small room. "Storm or no storm, I'm not freezing to death out here because we're too scared to move." "And go where?" Mark asked. He didn't look at him. "We don't even know which direction we came from. Anywhere's better than sitting here waiting for—" Nate cut himself off, but the word he didn't say hung in the air. Waiting for what? The fire popped. When night finally came, they laid out their sleeping bags close to the stove. No one admitted it, but they all wanted to be near the heat and near each other. Mark didn't sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. The roof creaked under the weight of snow. The sound was slow, rhythmic, almost like breathing. At some point, he realized the fire had burned low again. The cabin was dim, lit only by a faint orange glow. Thomas was sitting by the stove, still awake. "You hear it too?" Thomas asked quietly. Mark hesitated. "The wind?" "Not just the wind." They sat like that until the fire died completely, the cabin sinking into darkness. When Mark finally closed his eyes, it wasn't sleep that came, just the heavy, pressing weight of the storm outside, and the feeling that the world beyond the cabin had grown much farther away than it should have. The snow was gone. When Mark woke, his sleeping bag was damp. The air was warm, heavy, and smelled of wet earth. "Where's the snow?" Sarah's voice was hoarse. She was sitting up, looking at the window as though it had lied to her. "It's gone," Thomas said after a pause. He opened the door, and warm air rolled in, thick and sticky. "All of it. Like it never happened," Lena murmured. Nate pushed past them and stared at the clearing. "Great," he said bitterly. "I guess next we get a tornado." The sky was already turning darker. The first drops hit the roof, then a curtain of rain crashed down, so loud that it drowned out every other sound. "Back inside!" Mark shouted over the roar, and they slammed the door. For a while, they just sat there, listening to the storm hammer the tin roof. "This can't be normal," Sarah said finally, her voice trembling. "This place, it's wrong. The snow, the rain, it's like—" "Stop!" Thomas cut in sharply. "Panicking isn't going to help." "Neither is sitting here doing nothing," she snapped back. "We can't walk through this," Mark said. "We'd be lost in 5 minutes. So we just wait?" Nate's laugh was hollow. "For what exactly? For it to start raining blood next?" No one answered. The day dragged on, gray and wet. They kept the stove burning as long as they could, but the heat never seemed to last. Water ran down the windows in endless lines, turning the outside world into a smear. By evening, no one had the energy to argue. They just stared at the floor, at the fire, at nothing. When the rain stopped, it was so sudden that Sarah flinched. Finally, Nate muttered, standing, "Let's go before it starts again." "It's still night," Mark said. "We wait until morning." No one disagreed. When dawn came, Mark was the first to rise. He went to the window and froze. "Get up," he said quietly. Thomas joined him first. "What is it?" Mark just pointed. At the edge of the clearing, wolves stood in a loose semicircle. A dozen of them, maybe more, their dark fur slick with rain, steam rising from their backs. Every head was turned toward the cabin. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "They're not moving," Lena said. Her camera hung from her neck, but she didn't raise it. For hours, the wolves stayed exactly where they were. They didn't come closer, didn't retreat. Their stillness was worse than if they had attacked. "What are they waiting for?" Nate asked finally. No one had an answer. By midday, the light grew sharper. Without warning, the wolves turned and melted back into the trees. "That's it," Mark said, standing. "We're leaving." Now no one argued. They packed in silence and stepped off the porch. The clearing looked the same as it had that morning, only emptier. They walked. The forest was wet and close, branches slapping their faces. Mud sucked at their boots. Hours passed in silence except for the sound of water underfoot. As the light began to fade, they saw a break in the trees. Sarah stopped first. "No," she whispered. Lena stepped past her, her face pale. The clearing stretched before them. The cabin stood exactly as they had left it. The door still ajar, as though it had been waiting all along. No one spoke. Mark dropped his pack into the mud. His breath came slow and shallow. "We never left," Nate said at last, voice barely more than a breath, and the clearing was silent. If this story unsettled you, leave a like and let the shadows know. Subscribe for more tales you shouldn't hear after dark. And if you've seen something you can't explain, tell us in the comments. We're always listening.